historians and the building of the American nation. In the year 1783, the Treaty of Paris acknowledged the existence of the American nation. 4 years later, in 1789, the United States Constitution provided the legal and political framework for a national life as a constitution. But it was during the following century that the American nation, in the modern sense, was built. Soon after 1789, historians had done their share. The nation was celebrated in histories of the American Revolution and its heroes of the Democratic Republic, and in the now nationally oriented local and regional histories. By the early 1800s, histories of the representative democracy of such limited scope proved inadequate to portray properly the large-scale drama which was unfolding. In the span of a century, the United States, with its representative constitution, originally sparsely populated, predominantly rural, and located along the Atlantic seaboard, expanded thousands of miles to the southwest and the southeast, engulfed a vast continent, drew in millions of immigrants, and assimilated them, preserved its democratic government, originally designed for a much smaller state, fought wars, grew into a formidable industrial power, became urban in character, and finally maintained the Union and ended slavery in the ferocious Civil War. In the 19th century, the American national experience had epic character and brought forth appropriately epic histories by 5 major historians: that of George Bancroft, Francis Parkman, William Prescott, John Motley, and less successful in gaining popular renown, Richard Hildreth. All but Richard Hildreth were New Englanders, imbued with the sense of tradition of that region, highly literate, Harvard-educated, and possessed by a missionary commitment to what they considered the higher purpose or teleology of their country. Providence, Progress, and America's Past, Bancroft exerted by far the greatest influence with his History of the United States. His life prepared Bancroft admirably for his role as America's most influential 19th century historian, and he wrote primarily in the antebellum period, the period between the American Revolution and the Civil War, but he also wrote a little bit after the Civil War as well. He was a scion of the old New England family with a deep sense of tradition who grew up in an area immensely proud of its past. He wrote well and had learned the new historical methods at Göttingen and Berlin from von Heeren, Eichhorn, and Bach. He learned about his country's concerns, aspirations, and strength through his experience in public affairs as a Democratic politician in Massachusetts. Secretary of the Navy, Ambassador to England, sometime advisor to President Andrew Johnson, and Ambassador to Berlin, where she became acquainted with Bismarck, and witnessed the great European events between 1867 and 1873. Longevity, too, favored him. Born 4 years after George Washington's farewell address, he lived into the year 1891. The writing of his history alone spanned so many years. The first volume appeared in 1834, and the 12th volume in 1882, that tastes and moods changed during its composition. In preparing for the centenary edition of 1876, Bancroft felt compelled to tone down his original enthusiastic style by slaughtering adjectives. But his history remained, in Guizot's phrase, très démocratique. Ranke judged it the best history from a democratic view, and Carlyle characterized it as containing much light and no shade. For Bancroft, the American Revolution was no sudden struggle of colonists who wished to shed the fetters of the mother country, but a crucial way station in the development that had begun with the first English settlement in North America. Divine Providence had ordained the emergence of the United States in the course of human progress, an event to which the colonial experience was the prelude. A nation was already planted in New England, a commonwealth was ripened. In turn, the creation of the United States was not the ultimate achievement. The new nation would act as the pioneer of a novus ordo seclorum, a new order of the ages. America was not just to be another nation, but would exist for the advancement of the principles of everlasting peace and universal brotherhood. A new plebeian democracy took its place by the side of the proudest empire. The ages of servitude and inequality would end, eventually. With so lofty a theme, heroes as well were representations of greater forces. They were magnificent manifestations of national character. Bancroft considered the love of liberty the prime desire of all human beings. Hence, he had no doubt that Americans acted as one in the 1770s and 1780s, and would do so forever. What divided them did not match in importance or intensity their love of libertas. The American-specific form of libertas had an Anglo-Saxon origin. Virginians were Anglo-Saxons in the woods again, and the New Englanders carried on the tradition of Germanic liberty in their characteristic institutions. That vital principle of Teutonic liberty lies in the immemorial usage of the meeting of all the people with the equal rights of each qualified inhabitant in order to give counsel and to vote on public affairs. Again, the process of severing the tie between England and her American colonies began imperceptibly with the French and Indian War. After Protestant England had triumphed over Catholic France, matters drifted inexorably toward the decisive conflict. The change which divine wisdom ordained, and which no human policy or force could hold back, proceeded as majestically as the laws of being. While libertas had all along revealed itself at least to a few of the wise, in America it was the breath of life to the people. Americans heard the glad tidings of libertas which promised the political regeneration of the world. Their ideals and convictions were proclaimed to the world in the Declaration of Independence, the Confession of Faith of the rising empire, and the announcement of birth of a people. And where there were blemishes on the American record, such as slavery, Bancroft demonstrated how they had originated outside of the American realm and were continued as useful evils. Bancroft presented his story of the American past with enthusiasm, told it in a lively narrative, and in comparison with most contemporary historians, did extremely careful research. What made the esteem for his work eventually fade, however, was the fact that from the 1880s onwards, Bancroft and his nationalistic enthusiasm encountered historians possessed of a more critical, reflective mood. For some time, the public still read and cherished Bancroft's history for its drama and for its color. The new type of historians, however, with their enthusiasm for the methods and theories of science, a more complex vision of America, and a distrust of large-scale interpretations, honored him as a great historian, but at the same time, they discounted the value of his history. Decades before the so-called scientific American historians criticized Bancroft, Richard Hildreth put an altogether different account of the American past against Bancroft's work, or to be precise, against its first three volumes. Hildreth's work, the first American history reaching to 1821, was shaped not by the idealist, but by the utilitarian philosophy. It knew no nation as historical actor and recognized no divinely ordained progress. That made Hildreth's history an instrument of analysis for secular historians, not a voice for national inspiration, and his life one of disappointments. Of centennial sermons and Fourth of July orations, whether professedly such or in the guise of history, there are more than enough. It is due to our fathers and ourselves, it is due to truth and philosophy, to present for once on the historic stage the founders of our American nation, unbedaubed with patriotic rows, wrapped up in no fur-spun cloaks of excess and apology, often rude, hard, narrow, superstitious, and mistaken, but always earnest, downright, manly, and sincere. The result of their labors is eulogy enough. Their best apology is to tell their story exactly as it was. Hildreth depicted not an American people united by an American spirit, but a nation of social groups, each following its materialistic interests, landowners, opposed shareholders, entrepreneurs, opposed workers, as in general the working people confronted aristocratic elites. Even the writers of the Constitution were partially guided by such interests. The public was unwilling to accept such a past. New Englanders did not appreciate his calling the Puritans religious enthusiasts dominated by superstition. And then Southerners rejected Hildreth for his criticism of slavery. If one thought, as Bancroft did, of a general progress towards liberty in America, one hardly appreciated Hildreth saying that this is not a true representation of the case. if in certain parts of the American Union the experiment of democracy be steadily and quietly pursued, and at length become predominant in certain and other parts of the country, it is quite overshadowed, and it is reduced to creep pale and sickly on the ground by another experiment, less important, to wit, the experiment of despotism. It did not help that his inductive history deprived his history of any guiding themes or lessons, and his cool, dry style found no favor with readers who had the choice of reading Bancroft. Hildreth had anticipated the age of realism in America and had failed. History as drama. The other three narrative historians, Francis Parkman, William Prescott, and John Lothrop Motley, held much in common: a New England origin, Harvard associations, a gift for writing well, and the fact that their fascination with the American past did not lead them to write histories of the United States, but of topics more or less related to it. Parkman and Prescott also shared a handicap. They had severely impaired sight. Despite the sneers of those who denied that a Harvard man could have a true understanding of the West and the frontiers of the Americas, Parkman left to posterity a lucid and fascinating account of the land and those who explored it, of the Native Americans, and of the struggle between England and France for the control of the continent. All of that was a grand adventure, and Parkman treated it as such. The world of the forest and the deeds of venturesome men dominated his work. On occasion, the events transcend their narrow frame. The History of the Conspiracy of Pontiac, 1851, described people and their actions at a point where the American forest and the American Indian received their final doom. Parkman's many volumes on France and England and North America were variations on a grand theme: France, representing the old regime, absolutism, and Rome struggled against England, standing for liberty and Protestantism. But these forces did not obscure the deeds of brave individuals. Thus, while Parkman disliked Catholic doctrine and its representative, France, he admitted the Jesuit explorers. Even the final battle between the two great forces came down to one between two brilliant generals, Wolfe and Montcalm. Parkman's sympathy was joined to a lawyer's desire for accuracy. Nearly blind, he retraced many of the routes of the French Jesuits, visited battlefields, studied hundreds of documents, talked with settlers, and lived among Indians, all in order to capture life's fullness. Spain, with her past grandeur and power, interested 19th century Americans, who in their drive to greatness still had to consider Spain, and did so with the suspicion they reserved for tyrannical states. She evoked a special interest in William Prescott because of his association with George Ticknor, professor of French and Spanish at Harvard, who had brought together a considerable collection of Spanish material. When Prescott, a gentleman of means, searched to find a life-work task, he decided to write a history of the reign of Ferdinand and Isabella, an account of Spain's birth. After its favorable reception, Prescott proceeded to write on the conquest of Mexico and Peru and on Philip II. While Prescott disdained absolutism and Catholicism, he managed to see the Spanish past through Spanish eyes, and his American readers forgave him the lack of the customary disdainful view of Spain because his books held their interest. Spain figured as the grand adversary in three works on Dutch history by John Motley and another, Boston Brahmin. He had learned his historical craftsmanship in Göttingen and Berlin, possessed the literary aspirations and skills of other New England historians, and knew Europe from his prolonged diplomatic service there. His message was once more that history was progressing unalterably toward liberty for all. Indeed, without the story of progress, he found history a contemptible enterprise. In his best-known work, The Rise of the Dutch Republic, he depicted the Dutch War for Independence as a historical parallel to the American Revolutionary War. The hero, Protestant William of Orange, fought the oppressor, Catholic Philip II, much the same as Washington later battled George III. And like other contemporary historians, he hoped that his works would influence the public. If 10 people in the world hate despotism a little more and love civil and religious liberty a little better, in consequence of what I have written, I shall be satisfied. These, then, were the histories people read most often from among the rich assortment of historical works that were available, despite the label of literary historian, which now stigmatizes Bancroft, Parkman, Prescott, and Motley. Their works were based on sincere scholarly efforts, although their methods have seemed outdated to later historians. Readers liked it that these historians kept a fair distance from pedantry and made the narrative flow in the manner of dramas and novels. They appreciated the appropriately chosen language. Prescott had expressly worried about a democratic style marked by a choice of simple words, juxtaposing it to English aristocratic eloquence and the complex German scholarly language. The service of the literary historians rendered their nation compared well with that offered by contemporary European historians to their countries. From the works of these historians, a young and vibrant nation drew up inspiration, pride, and even plain enjoyment as readers watched liberty emerge through the ages, democracy establish its heroic bulwark in the United States, and the once great Spain decline. And when Bancroft, Parkman, Prescott, and Motley yielded their places to a new generation of historians, more skeptical and with stricter methodologies, that generation was helped immeasurably by the public interest literary historians had created for historical works. The persistence of national history. Bancroft lived long enough to notice not only the continuing popularity of his works, but also the gradual changes in the United States after the Civil War. That war had clearly been a turning point in American life and was becoming a new focus for historical interest. Bancroftian national historians had to accommodate it in their scheme of history, in which so far the Revolutionary War and its period had been the crucial American experience. It was not Bancroft whose works never reached beyond the period of the Revolution, but the national historians of the latter 19th century who formulated the proper response. For them, the preservation of the Union in the first truly modern war with all its horrors was once more testimony to the providential course Americans steered, a conviction even shared by those national historians who counted themselves among the new scientific historians. Although on that basis it was still possible to speak of the good side versus the evil side, those who supported the Union and rejected slavery, and those whose preferences were for the Confederacy and for slavery. The question was, however, why such a catastrophic war? It still needed an answer. The debate which ensued has not ceased yet. And the ideas of the national historians on nation progress and libertas were not immediately questioned, but the ever closer scrutiny to which the politics and events of the Civil War period were subjected soon put in doubt the romantic notion of the American nation as a harmonious whole. Competing interests, ideals, and groups became all too visible. In the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, there ensued, as is usual in such cases, a war guilt debate. The question raised was not so much why did it happen, but whose fault was it? The highly partisan historiographical scene resounded quickly with recriminations. The Southerners accused the North of ignorance about Southern life, of being motivated by fanaticism and an unrealistic ideal of equality, and of disregarding the South's legitimate grievances. The Northerners, however, spoke of a slave power conspiracy in Congress and in the executive branch prior to the war, and deplored all the preceding compromises on slavery as futile and extremely evil. Southerners denied above all that slavery had constituted the main issue. The issue, really, was states' rights versus federal power, specifically the right to secede. Northern writers insisted on the centrality of the slavery issue, however, and saw the Civil War as an irrepressible conflict between that of freedom and that of slavery. As the years went by, however, the bitterness faded bit by bit, and the transformation of the Civil War went into an event in national history. In the 1870s, books and magazines presented accounts from writers of both the North and the South. Gradually, those who praised persons, groups, and regiments, whether on the losing or the winning side, referred to the national framework. A further reduction of partisanship came from the ideal of what is called scientific historiography. But while the heat of the debate lessened and some conspiracy theories and worst epithets were dropped, the discussion of the Civil War remained firmly linked to moral issues and judgments. Hermann von Holst found no contradiction between his German critical training, which made him appreciate sources like newspapers as well as congressional records, and his speaking of the immortality of slavery, of the need of decaying societies to yield to vigorous, better ones, and of the logic of morality in history. James Schouler replaced the term conspiracy with the less sinister word rebellion, and held that differing ideas and circumstances led to the war rather than conspiracies of individuals. Stern anti-slavery moral judgments would even be combined with sympathies for some Southerners, as James Ford Rhodes demonstrated. These historians saw no contradiction between their scientific aspirations and their moral stance, because they, in the Bancroftian manner, still identified the goals of the Union with the goals of history. Hence, a pro-Union view was simply the true view, and that made it possible for them to make concessions to the other side, such as expressing admiration for General Lee and condemning certain aspects of the Reconstruction period.